Okay, good morning everyone. Welcome to Monday. I'm going to say good morning to some people. There's actually nobody in the class right now, just me. So we'll just deal with you online people. So Basil, good morning Basil. Nice to have you here. Simran's here. Good morning Simran. Sean is here. Good morning Sean. Reza's here. Good morning Reza. Basil's here. There he is. Good morning Basil. And Hassan is here. Good morning, Hassan. So, I hope everyone had a good weekend. I think are we week 9 now? Yeah, we're getting toward the end of this course. Yeah, let's see. This is 9, 10, 11. No, we're week 10, 11, 12, 13. Yeah, wow, week 10. Okay, so we have good morning. We have a final project coming up, which I will talk to you about a little bit later in class, and that will there'll be a few parts to it. There'll be a presentation aspect to it, but again, we'll deal with that. We'll deal with that toward the end of class. Okay. For now, let's dive into where we were. Whoops, let me turn that off. Let's dive into where we were last week. So, where were we last week? Yes, okay. So we kind of finished talking about Indigenous people in Canada and their experience and how, Canada has a racist history, right? And again, it's very easy to point the finger at a country like the United States and say that they have a racist history, which they do, but Canada does as well, right? And we said that race was something that was created in order to justify colonialism, right? Justify why, white Europeans get to, take things that belong to other people and enslave them and marginalize them and brutalize them in some cases. And, very sadly, that's the history that we have here in Canada with Indigenous people. And so we watched a documentary last week called Eighth Fire, and again, there's a bunch of different episodes of this series, so if you found it interesting. Hi. Oh, hi Elizabeth, come on in, have a seat anywhere you like. So we watched this documentary and we said that so I said we watched this documentary. There's other episodes if you're interested in watching. There's there might be 8 actually, which would make sense for the title. But Indigenous people are, still a living people, right? They're not in history. They're not in a museum, and we need to sort of understand that, right? It's important to look at the past and things like Indian residential schools because they still have significant effects in the present, but we also need to look at that present, right? And so I asked you a bunch of questions here, which I won't go through again. But basically, what we're seeing, I think, is Indigenous people trying to reclaim and rebuild their culture, right? And so their world and their life has changed around them, really without their consent. They have been subjected to racist policies for the past 200 or 250 years. And so now they're kind of rebuilding, right? And we saw a lot of ways in which that's happening, right? And some people are using art, like Kent Monkman. Some people are using religion, like Winnipeg's Most. Some people are using scholarship, right? We heard from a few Indigenous scholars and lawyers. Some people are using education, right? We learned from we heard from people who are running an Indigenous daycare in Quebec, right? And so there's all kinds of ways in which people are kind of reclaiming their cultural identity, spreading their teachings, and kind of trying to make space for themselves in Canada, right? And so our job is to kind of make that space, right? Our job is to kind of allow them that space to do those things. But again, it's still a difficult relationship, and it's still a long way from healed, right? It's still a long way from reconciled. We have We did a Truth and Reconciliation Commission about residential schools. That commission or that committee recommended that Canada do 94 things. We haven't done 94 things. If we've done 4 things, I might be surprised. So not much has happened, right? We had an inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women, because Indigenous women go missing and are murdered at a far higher rate than non-Indigenous women in Canada. But again, not much has happened, right? The Indian Act is still in force as it was before. There's still negative stereotypes and discrimination happening against Indigenous people. And so, again, we know a lot of things and we're learning a lot of things, but not much has changed yet, which is frustrating, right? And especially frustrating when, you see a politician like Justin Trudeau come into power in 2015, I think it was 2015, and he made big promises about how he was going to create a nation-to-nation relationship with Indigenous people. That did not happen. We're still waiting for that one, whatever that is. So, yeah, things are moving frustratingly slowly, unfortunately. Okay, the next thing I want to do is something that it's related to racism. It's related to some of the concepts we've talked about already, and it's a little exercise in kind of university. Okay, in university practice, protocol, strategy, whatever you want to say. I'm going to guess that most of you will continue on to some sort of university or college after this. Yeah? Okay. And maybe I'll come to that in a second. Let me just review for you. Oppression is this, right? Oppression is a set of policies or traditions or norms or practices that privilege one group and disadvantage another, right? And so, again, oppression happens at a society-wide level, and it's, again, to use the board game analogy, it creates rules for the game that allow some people to get ahead much easier, right? And others are held back. We have dominant and minoritized groups, which we've talked about. I'm going to jump ahead here, and I'm going to remind you about internalized dominance and internalized oppression, right? And so remember, when people act out their internalized dominance, they're acting out the idea that they're in the dominant group, right? And so they kind of subconsciously know that they have more power over other people, and they kind of use it in a way, right? Or they express the fact that, they express their dominance in some way, right? And so we had a lot of examples of this earlier on, right? Where we talked about, people asking, oh, well, where are you from, right? And most often that question in Canada gets asked to non-white people, right? And so, again, the message is like, oh, well, you don't belong here, right? You must be from somewhere else, right? But nobody ever asks me where I'm from, right? They just assume I'm Canadian because, again, the stereotype, the idea is that Canadians are white, right? That Canada is a white country. And again, it's may have started out that way, but that's not entirely who we are anymore, right? So anyway, people acting out their internalized dominance, people acting out their internalized oppression kind of do similarly, right? They act out the social messaging they've received, but usually those messages are negative about their own group, right? And so, again, we saw this in Jane Elliott's class with the blue-eyed and the brown-eyed kids. The blue-eyed kids acted out their internalized oppression, right? The society, right, the class, the teacher, society told them that they weren't very good students and they weren't very smart. And what happened? They started to act it out, right? That actually became a reality. And so sometimes we see that happening with both dominant and minoritized groups. Dominant groups will act out their dominance in some way. Minoritized groups will sometimes act out their oppression in some way. Right, okay, so I'm going to jump ahead. Here's what I want to get to. Okay, so when you get to university, university profs are going to ask you to read university level academic journal articles, okay? And they're going to be, some of them are going to be boring, I'm sorry to say. Some of them are going to be quite long. And your strategy here is to figure out how to read smart, right? Because when you're in university, you're going to have lots of things to do, right? You're going to have a bunch of classes, you're going to have maybe work, right? Maybe you'll have a job, and you'll probably want to have some fun while you're there, right? You'll probably want to have some sort of a social life. So you don't want to spend all your time reading long articles, or maybe you do, and if you do, go for it, right? But if you don't, I'm going to try and help you out here a little bit. And so we're going to read an actual, honest-to-God, academic journal article here that has to do with race and gender oppression, but in the, good morning, in the classroom, okay? So it's a kind of a situation or an environment that we're familiar with, and so that will kind of help us navigate through this exercise, okay? Now, what I'll ask you at the end of this paper, I'll ask you what the author's argument is, as I often do, and then I'll ask you, how does oppression affect these people, these individual interactions, and how does this affect what we know about, knowledge? Okay, I don't know the answer to that third question, but it should be interesting. So, when you find an academic paper, right? So if you go to an academic journal, we have scientists and writers writing these things all the time. They're cranking them out like crazy. There's more papers than you could ever hope to read. Good morning. There's more papers out there than you could ever hope to read. But fortunately, no matter what discipline you go into, whether it's a hard science or whether it's engineering or whether it's biology or sociology or whatever you find yourself in, most academic articles are actually structured the same way. They are built the same way. They have the same parts, okay? And so if we know what these parts are, and we know that all articles are basically built the same, then we can kind of be choosy about what parts of them we decide to read, right? And that can help move us along, right? That can help to minimize our reading time. Because again, you're all very busy, you have work, you have social lives. You don't want to spend all your time reading these things, right? So, this is what all articles tend to have, okay? They will have an abstract at the beginning, right? So they'll have a very short summary of what the article is about. Sometimes they will tell you what their argument is right in the abstract. Actually, most of them do. And then they'll get into the paper. So they'll have an introduction where they talk about, or they introduce the topic, right? So just a general introduction. We're familiar with introductions, I think. Sometimes they'll have some sort of theoretical framework, right? So what theories do they believe? What things do they think are true in order for them to interpret their evidence, right? So everybody has to work from a particular theory or a particular theoretical background. In an article, they'll tell you what it is right here, right? Sometimes there will be a literature review, okay? Not always, but sometimes. Literature reviews are basically the author proving that they have read they've read everything there is to read on the topic that they're writing about, okay? So if you're writing about, I don't know, cat metabolism, right? Then you'll want to show to the scientific community that you've read all the stuff about cat metabolism, right? Certainly the big important papers that everyone reads and thinks are true, right? So in a literature review, you'll see that. They'll talk all about, articles that they've read. This is what this person said. This is what this person said, blah, 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 blah. It's very boring to read, super boring to write. If you ever write a thesis or a dissertation, not fun, but anyway, that's okay. Sometimes you'll have a methodology, okay? So again, if you're in a science class, you might be familiar with this. Your methodology is kind of what you do, right? How you run your experiment. How many times did you run your experiment? What kind of materials did you use, right? How did you collect your data? All of that will be in methodology. Then they'll give you sometimes. They'll give you the actual data, right? So the actual results of the experiment. Then they'll analyze it. They'll tell you how they process this data. And then finally, they'll come to the results or the discussion or the conclusion, right? So they'll tell you, we did this experiment. This is what we did with the numbers, and this is what we think it all means, right? This is what we think we can learn from this experiment, okay?
Sorry, in what part is the premises included into the premise?
The premise or premises? You would probably find them mentioned in the abstract. You may find them in the introduction. You will probably find them in the analysis and the results discussion conclusion. Okay, so again, it kind of depends what the person is using to prove their case, right? And so if they're using the results of their data analysis, then that's going to come up. That's going to come up in analysis or in results, right? And so this is the question we tried to answer. We think this is the answer, and this is why we think it's the answer, right? So those things will kind of show up there. So as you might guess here, again, most academic articles have these pieces. Some of them they omit. Some of them are called slightly different things, but most of them are just this pattern, right? They all follow this pattern. And so as a first-year university student or college student, you're going to be able to, and you'll be happy to hear this, you're going to be able to skip a number of these sections, okay? Because a lot of it is too much, it's boring, and really what the prof wants you to know, usually, unless they say otherwise, is they want you to know the argument, right? What question is this paper answering, right? How are they proving that this is true, right? That's what they really want to know. The prof doesn't want you to know every little detail of the paper, right? And again, if you want to read it all, fantastic, right? But if you think that every detail in every paper is important, you're going to be wasting a lot of time because it's really not, okay? So I'm going to say this. If you're a first-year student and you're reading an academic article, I think you can safely skip a bunch of these sections, okay? So if I were you and I was reading an academic article, this is what I would read. I would 100% read the abstract, right? Because it's a nice little summary of what the whole article is about. So at least you know where you're going, right? You know what you're going to read. You can read the introduction if you want. Sometimes that's nice to do, but you can also skip it, right? Theoretical framework, I don't think I would read it. Usually it's not that important, especially for a first-year student who might not know all of the theoretical background. Sometimes you get your theory and method courses a little bit later, like second or third year. So you can read it, but you won't really be able to do much with it, probably. Literature review, totally boring. I would skip it, unless you're looking for good, unless you're looking for other things that have been written on that topic. Then that's great. Literature review will give you everything you need on that topic, but otherwise I'd skip it. Methodology you can have a quick look at depending on what the discipline is. As a first-year student, you probably won't be able to critique the methodology, right? Some of these things are kind of more there for other academics, right? So, if another scientist is reading this paper and they're like, oh no, look at the methodology, you forgot to do this equation or whatever, right? And so it's more for people who know more. As a first-year university student, you probably won't be able to critique it very well. Maybe have a quick glance at it, but I wouldn't read it too deeply. The data, sometimes you can look at it. It kind of depends on how much there is, right? If you have pages of numbers and spreadsheets, it's kind of hard to look at that, right? So I would skip over it. Depends what the data is. Definitely the analysis, that's the meat, right? That's the good part. So you definitely want to read the analysis and see how they came up with their answers, right? And you definitely want to read the results because that's the whole point, right? That's where they say, this is the answer to our question. This is why we think it's the answer. And sometimes you'll hear things like, and this is where we'll go from here, right? This is what research will do to follow up on this, right? Or this is what it means for, sociology or anthropology or the world or whatever, right? So those last two are definitely important. The others you can kind of skim over, but again, for a first year student, the prof's probably not going to ask you about any of that stuff. And so really what the prof wants you to know is, what's this paper about? What question does it answer? And how does it answer those questions? That's kind of it. And so again, you can shave a 30-page paper down to 6, right? Which again will help you out because you're all busy and you want to have social lives, right? Yeah. So with that in mind, I want to read a real academic paper, right? But again, I don't want to read all of it. I just want to read some of it, okay? So let me see what my next slide is. Okay. So what I'd like you to do then is start reading this paper. So it's in Microsoft Teams, it's under Files, and I'm just going to open it up here. There it is. So when I look at it here if I look at the PDF here, it's 14 pages long, right? But again, we're not going to read every section. And if you go to the end, you'll see that 1, 2, 3, yeah, the last 3 pages are all references, right? They're all kind of works cited. So again, you're really down to, you're down to 11 pages already. And again, we're going to cut out a lot of this stuff. So really we're looking at maybe 4 pages or so. So not bad, right? We can just shave this down. And again, I think what you'll see is that when we cut out the pieces that we don't really want to read, and when we focus on the argument, it'll be pretty easy to deal with a paper like this, right? And once you have the argument, then you can dig into the paper for other things if you so desire, okay? So I'm going to give you some time to start reading. Again, read the abstract. You can just scan through some of these things if you want, but when you get the thing you want to get to is is kind of the good stuff, right? The analysis and the discussion at the end. Cool? Say again? What's it called? It's called Race and Gender Oppression in the Classroom. Is it there? It's not there? Uh-oh. Okay, give me 1 second here. I will double check and make sure. Social justice, general files. Do you see it? Okay. Oops. So let me just put some time on the clock here. That'll help us keep track. just a quick check-in, guys. How we doing? Is it okay to read? In terms of difficulty, where would you say it is on a scale of 1 to 10? 1 being super easy and 10 being, oh my god, this is really hard. 3? Okay. Yeah? Not bad. Maybe a little higher. 3 to 5? 3 to 6? It's okay if it is, right? It's okay if it's a little bit, good morning. It's okay if it's a little bit higher because, again, you know, this, like we're in high school and this article isn't made for you guys, right? It's made for academics, it's made for university levels. So, yeah, like if you're struggling a little bit, that's good, right? Because it's a little above where we are right now. So, and if you're sailing through it, then fantastic, right? Sorry, Poom, did you have a question?
I cannot find it. The file.
It is in Microsoft Teams. It's under Files, and it is it's called what is it called? Racism and Oppression in the Classroom. Hang on. It's if it doesn't show up for you, Poom, you might want to close and then restart your Teams. Sometimes it'll appear after that.
What is it?
What's what?
What is the name?
The name is Race and Gender Oppression in the Classroom. If you look, I put it up there 4 days ago, but it.
There it is. That's the one.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, so as I say, if it's a little bit difficult, that's okay. I expect it to be, but we'll get through it. I'll tell you what, I'm gonna put 5 more minutes on the clock, and then we'll take a break, okay?
So sorry, like all the university level articles, they have subheadings, right?
So yeah, they'll all be a little bit different depending on what they're talking about, but usually they'll be divided up in a way that makes it easy to, to know what's coming next. And that actually is a good strategy as well, is scanning through and reading the headings just to see what's there, right? Especially if you're short for time and you know you're looking for one thing, then yeah, that can help. Okay, good people. The clock is now at 0, so let's take a quick break. When we come back, we'll take a few more minutes to finish reading this if we need that, and then we can talk about what we've read in the article, okay? So, quick break, and then we'll come back and do that. Okay, and we're, oh, I'm gonna turn that off. Okay, and we're back. How much more time do you think we need to finish reading this here? Can you give me a bit of an estimate? 10 minutes? Too long? Too little? How about 7? How about 7? 10 seems a little long. Let's do 7, okay? 7 minutes. We will talk about um, we'll talk about this article. We'll talk about what the argument is. Yep. 7 minutes. Whoops. Better put that on the screen. There we go. Okay, good people. Let's take a crack at this one, okay? So one of the reasons why I've kind of spent so much time on this critical thinking argument thing and why we keep coming back to it, because again, like I said, it's important, right? It's important in life, it's important in the world, but it's also important for an article like this, right? Because if you don't really know anything about arguments or critical thinking, you might go into this paper in a university context and you're like, oh God, I have 14 pages of stuff. Like, what do I need to do, right? Do I need to memorize all this? How do I determine what's important, right? And again, figuring out the argument is what helps you figure out what's important, right? Again, I gave you some, you know, handy tips of, sections you can skip usually, right? But really what you want to know is the argument, right? The argument is that paper's reason for existing, right? Without the argument, there's no point to the paper at all, right? So if we can identify what that argument is, then the rest of the paper makes sense, right? We'll know what the important stuff is and then what the stuff on kind of the outside is, right? So here we have an article that we've read. I think it's a fairly easy one. It seems to be written in fairly, reasonably simple English. Some authors like to sound smart, so they use lots of big words, and it makes it very difficult for people to read their work. This one's pretty good. Shavella Pittman has done a good job. I feel like this is probably her master's thesis that she turned into an article. That's kind of what it feels like to me, but I could be wrong about that. So let's start off with the argument, okay? So what's Shavella Pittman's main point? What thing is she asking us to believe here?
Gender racism in the classrooms, especially in context of white male students.
Yeah, exactly. So she's trying to convince us that women of color are experiencing gendered racism in the classroom pretty much exclusively from white male students, right? That's good. That is her conclusion, right? And so why should we believe that? Ms. Pittman or Dr. Pittman, I'm not sure if she's a doctor. Dr. Pittman, I'm going to give her the benefit of the doubt here. Why should we believe that? What evidence does she give us that female professors of color are experiencing this gendered racism? Give me one.
She did some interview questions.
Yep.
And
So
most of the women of color people, they responded that they face, they feel that, they face that the white male students, they usually challenge the authority,
Yep.
especially the teaching competency,
Yep.
and disrespect the polarity that teach.
Right. There we go. So yeah, so that was kind of a bit of the methodology, right? How did she collect her data? Well, she did a bunch of interviews, right? That was how she collected her data, right? And interestingly, she says in her it's right at the beginning of the results section. She says that white male this pattern with white male students appeared, but she said that keep in mind it's important to note that women faculty of color were asked about their experiences with all students, right? So she didn't create this pattern herself, right? If she said, hey, how do white male students treat you, then she would have been basically creating her own results, right? But she just said, what are your experiences with students, right? And these women of color are reporting that it seems to be white male students that are the biggest issue here, right? And so, yeah, Rafay points out, there's basically three premises here, right? How do these female professors of color, how do they experience gendered racism? Well, white male students are challenging their authority in the classroom, they are questioning their teaching competency, and they're disrespecting their scholarly expertise, right? So yeah, kind of three premises, right? What are some examples of how students are challenging their authority? How are these students challenging their authority? Hmm? Yeah, what kind of behaviors? What's that? Say that one more time. Oppressive behavior? Yes, but how do we know what behavior is oppressive?
They open the door without knocking. They
Oh.
open the door without knocking.
Okay. Which is interesting again, right? Because a lot of times we've seen this pattern before a number of times where members of the dominant group, when they interact with members of the minoritized group, they feel like they don't have to follow the same social rules, right? Suddenly you can kind of do whatever you want, right? And so these students just walk into these women's office, right? Should you do that, or is it polite to give a little knock at the door, right? It's kind of a polite thing to do, but these guys just barge in, right? What else are these women talking about in terms of authority? Are they what? Right. So in order to kind of be an authority figure in the classroom, they have to be very careful about how friendly they are, right? They don't want to be too soft or people won't take them seriously, right? And so, yeah, she's, I forget which, yeah, I guess that's Karen, right? The black professor, right? She says, yeah, I have to be careful how friendly I am. What else? How else do these students challenge authority?
It's that in an interaction, the white student refers to a male because remember as a doctor with a PhD holder.
Yeah.
Even though K is also a PhD holder. This is very hard to perceive.
Interesting, yeah. So the student sends her an email and says, hey, Kate, first name, right? And then in the next line says, Dr. So-and-so told me I should talk to you, right? And so he, probably not on purpose, but he refers to her by her first name and then refers to Dr. So-and-so by like their professional, with a doctor, right? The thing that's interesting about some of these authority things, and you may have read this, you did read this, is that some of these women struggle with whether they're actually seeing this or not, right? Whether this is real, right? And I think maybe it's the email one where the hang on, I think it is the email one. Oh yeah. It's Alice who says this, and Alice says, yeah, white males will open my door without knocking. They're snide. They sit with their arms crossed and doodle and sit up front so they can kind of roll their eyes. And the tone of emails they send, it's kind of funny because it's the kind of thing you don't know how to express to other people. But it's like if I was a white male, you wouldn't dare write to me in that tone, right? So this is the other thing is about kind of how oppression plays out in real life with microaggressions and things like that. Is people in minoritized groups are always kind of questioning whether, like, did that happen? Like, is that person just a jerk? Am I reading too much into this, or is this is race or gender a problem here, right? And that's what Alice is saying. She's like, sometimes it's just this undercurrent of behavior, and you're never really sure if this is a racially or sexually or sexism motivated, right? What about the other one here, the second one, teaching competency? How do these students question their teaching competency?
This is starting nonsense that emails me the teacher,
Yeah,
Karen.
yeah,
He said, I have some teaching experience too as an undergraduate, and one thing I know is that if you make a mistake, then you're supposed to spend time with the correction in class, and the fact that he didn't do that, or his mistakes in the best is not a class, that I don't need to do any time says that this black guy, he taught two sixth graders,
yeah.
and I feel that's completely what they were doing.
Yeah, yeah. So she makes a mistake. It sounds like a history class, but who knows? She makes a mistake, right? She says the wrong. There were actually two U.S. presidents named Roosevelt, right? She says the wrong Roosevelt. She says, "Whoops, sorry, made a mistake. Not this one, the other one." Carried on, right? And he has this reaction, right? And he sends her this long email about, how, he knows how to teach people and she's doing it wrong, right? And yeah, he's got he taught some sixth graders once, right? She's a professor of history at a major institution, right? And so, they're not the same, right? She's a professional educator and he did this one time, right? And it's not the same, but he somehow thinks they are, right? And again, does race and gender have something to do with that? Well, it's hard to know, right? It's hard to know people's intentions. But again, it's very interesting. This pattern does not show up with female students, and it doesn't show up with students of color, right? It only shows up with white males, right? What's another one here? Oh, the exam. What happened on the exam?
So everyone did pretty badly in the exam,
Yeah,
and a very vocal like this, he failed.
yeah.
So he started blaming the teacher.
Yeah, and again, sometimes that happens, right? Sometimes students don't do well and they blame the teacher. Sometimes it is the teacher's fault. As a student, I've had some crappy teachers, and yeah, sometimes it is definitely their fault. But here again, the question is race and gender at play here? Does this guy feel more comfortable speaking out and saying, well, you didn't explain it properly, or you didn't, tell us what you were looking for in the right way, or, you're marking us too hard, right? Would he have said that to a white male professor? Again, maybe he would have, right? But also maybe he wouldn't have. And so, again, these things are really tough to know, right? And we have to kind of take these women's word for it, because it's very difficult to determine exactly the dynamic of what's going on. Disrespecting. One thing I wanted to point out here is the questioning teaching competency. They actually mentioned something right at the end of that section that we've talked about before. They talk about hegemonic masculinity. So there is a normative image of college professors as white men, right? So this goes back to the study we talked about with the resumes and the hiring, where I said that the lenses come down, right? People start to see other people through their stereotypes, and so if I ask you to, and this may be tricky because of course you're all from different countries, but for most North Americans, if you ask them, think of a college professor or university professor, they will picture an old white man in their head, right? He'll be older, he'll be white, he'll be a man, he'll be kind of a little odd, because lots of professors are a little kooky in some ways. So that's automatically who they will picture, right? And so when university students come into a class in North America and sit down, and in walks, let's say, a young black woman, right, or a young Asian woman, suddenly the lenses go down, right? Suddenly she's not who they expect to see. right? And so they start to see her through the stereotypes that they might have about black people, about Asian people, and about women, right? And again, in a combination, there's an intersection between those two identities of person of color and woman, and those identities can't be pulled apart, right? We can't really tell if these students are behaving that way because these instructors are women, or because they are people of color, or if it's both at the same time, right? You can't really pull those things apart. Disrespecting the scholarly expertise, how do students do that? How do students do that? Let's see here. Oh, the Blade Runner thing. Yeah, so the question here is, is the study of race and gender, are things that are feminist, stories and writings that are feminist, or stories that are from minoritized communities, are they as legitimate as those from white people, right? And often white people don't think so, right? And so this one student is not really that interested in minority stories, but then they watch Blade Runner, which is kind of a white male movie, and he's like, oh, this is good now, right? Now we're into the good stuff. And again, it's okay to enjoy the movie, but the question is that why is that thing, kind of more legitimate than the things they studied before, right? Let's see what else here.
And also shows in the paper, it has a broadened type of question about the in a white dominant society,
Yeah.
the minority story focuses on the afterlife and universe character. And so commented on that. I think what is it?
He says,
It's something I really like.
oh yeah. And so yeah, it's something I really like, which is fine, right? He's allowed to like that. But it's like, yes, but she says here, I think what he was conveying to me is that this is the real stuff, right? The other stuff is just stuff that you want me to know, right? So, yeah, the idea that they were dealing with knowledge that came from minoritized groups, whether it was from women or from racial or ethnic minorities, that stuff was like not real, right? In a way that Blade Runner was suddenly like, oh yeah, okay, now we're into real things, right? And part of this is threatening and intimidation. What happens in that section? Or what do they mention in that section?
Regarding the rights and skills that can be in state.
Say that one more time.
There was a time when a white male student was confronting a friend
Yeah.
about his grade.
Yeah. Yeah, so a couple of these students seem to be threatening, right? So they're angry, they're upset. Alice says that a white male student threw papers at her, right? Totally unacceptable, right? In any context. But again, if you want someone to regrade your paper, throwing it in their face is definitely not going to accomplish that goal, right? But again, think of the dynamics here, right? Maybe she's sitting at her desk, he's standing up, right? There's kind of a racial and gender thing going on. And yeah, this is unacceptable behavior, but threatening, right? And maybe scary, right? She doesn't know who this guy is. She doesn't know if he's going to become violent, right? They also mentioned threats about complaints, right? And so all universities have mechanisms where, if you have a grievance against an instructor, you can lodge a complaint, right? And again, if you have a legitimate complaint, you should do it, right? If you think your teacher is acting unfairly or unprofessionally, then yeah, by all means, complain, right? But don't use it as a threat, right? Don't use it as leverage to get what you want, right? If you feel that they didn't mark your paper high enough and you threaten to complain, that's a dick move. don't do that, right? But again, if you have a complaint, by all means, complain, right? That's what it's there for. But here, these white students are using it as a threat, right? Do what I want or else. And interestingly, often what we see is that women professors and women professors of color are on average rated lower than white male professors. So there's some bias going on here already in terms of how they are ranked by their students when you do the course evaluations. They tend to do worse, right? And again, it's not due to the fact that they're worse teachers or worse scholars. It's that people are seeing them through the lenses of their gender and racial stereotypes, right? And so, again, universities have to be very careful with that when they do student evaluations, because they know that there is this bias within it, right? Let me see. Okay. Right. Okay. So that's good. So we've got the argument down, right? We've nailed the argument. We know how oppression affects these individual interactions because she's explained it to us, right? Shavella has offered a few quotes from some of the people she interviewed. I'm sure the names have all been changed, of course. What I want to do right now, very quickly, is I want to introduce the final project to you so that we can get going, okay? So let me just open it up. I'm going to put it on the screen here, but I'm going to post it in Microsoft Teams for us so that you'll have it. Where is it? Yesterday. Okay. There it is. Okay. So, as I mentioned before, there is no final exam in this course. There's just a final project, okay? And so this will be what our final project is. It's a presentation. So at the end of the course in the last week, what I will want you to do is will want you to come up here with a presentation, like a keynote or a PowerPoint, and I want you to teach us, right? And so I want you to choose a specific social justice issue, okay? And I can help you kind of brainstorm through that idea a little bit later. Choose an issue, investigate what it looks like here in North America, okay? How is it connected to the things that we have studied in class, right? So I want to see some evidence that you have learned some things in here, right? And then finally talk about what can or is being done to fix this issue, okay? So simple in practice, but there'll be a lot of work to do, okay? So you'll be up here, you'll be the experts, and I will get to ask you questions, as will the rest of the class, okay? So you'll have to be ready. You can work in pairs or you can work on your own. It is your choice. If you work in pairs, I want to see an equal collaboration, okay? So I have seen some people present where clearly they got together, they said, okay, I'll do the first half and you do the second half. They each go away and then they like stick them together. And so the presentation is like totally different formats, and I don't want to see that. I want to see a true, unified effort. But of course, you're both going to get the same grades. So if you choose a partner, choose one wisely. Yes? Cool.
What should be presentation?
What should you what?
I mean, the topic.
We'll get to that. We'll get to that. Okay? So, I want the presentation to be about 10 minutes or so, which might sound like a lot. In some ways it is, and in some ways it isn't. It sounds like a long time to talk in front of the class, but I guarantee you 10 minutes is not that long. In your PowerPoint, there should be some text on the screen. There should be some pictures on the screen. I don't want any videos in your presentation because I want to hear from you. If I want to watch videos, I'll just go on YouTube. I've got the app on my phone, so I can do that. I want to hear you speaking, okay? Let's see. Right? And there are going to be 3 parts to this, okay? And so what I'll ask you to do is settle on a topic by Wednesday. So I'll have some time tomorrow for you to do a little bit of internet research, poke around, talk to each other, talk to me, and figure out what your topic is going to be, okay? One thing that I'll talk to you about tomorrow, or I'll repeat tomorrow, is the narrower you can make your topic, the better, right? I think a lot of students worry that if they're too specific, they won't be able to say anything, like if it's too narrow. But interestingly, it's the other way around, right? So if you choose racism as a topic, which you shouldn't because it's not a good topic. If you just choose racism, racism is huge, right? It's such a massive topic that all you're going to be able to say is just some very uninteresting general things, right? And so it's not going to make for a very good presentation. But look at what Adam Pearson did with his documentary, right? He focused on people with disabilities, and then he only focused on people with facial disfigurements, right? That was his whole thing. And he got like an hour documentary out of it, right? So that's kind of the thing I want you to do, is narrow it down to one specific kind of group or experience or instance, and then you can actually say some interesting things. And I think Adam was able to say a lot of interesting things, right? But that was because he narrowed it down, right? If he just talked about disableism, it wouldn't have been as interesting and as focused, right? So again, as a student, you might think, oh, I don't want to get too narrow or I won't be able to say anything. Actually, it's the opposite. If you can narrow it down a bit, that's where you can actually say something interesting rather than just, yes, racism is bad, blah, 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 right? So I'll give you some time to do that tomorrow. I'll help you a little bit if we need to. Part 1 is sources. So I want you to find some credible, trustworthy sources. I'll talk to you about that tomorrow and how to do that. And I'd like you to hand it in on Monday, okay? So it'll just be a short list of sources, properly formatted in MLA format, so I can look at them, okay? That's the first part. Second part is building your presentation. I will give you some class time to work on this, so I'll help you out in that regard. Again, visual aids are necessary and they are great. Some slides with some words and some pictures and maybe some graphs would be awesome. But again, no videos, and I also don't want you to be reading don't read your slides, okay? Nobody likes that. Some people do it even at like major conferences. Nobody wants to hear you read, right? I want you to talk, okay? I want you to talk from up here. And then finally, there's a peer feedback part of it. And so for the audience here, after each presentation, I'll ask you to provide 2 questions about what you have learned and what you still want to learn, or what you still wonder about the topic in the presentation you just heard, Okay, so there'll be something for the presenters to do, but there'll also be something for the audience to do as well. Okay? I will provide you with, oh yeah, okay. So grading breakdown is right there. Sources are worth 15%, presentations worth 75%, peer feedback is worth 10. I will give you a marking guide for these so that you kind of know what I'm looking for. Okay, so you have some idea how I'm going to grade this. Also keep in mind you got to do all parts of this assignment in order to receive a grade. So you can't just say, well, screw it, I don't feel like doing the sources, I'm just going to do the last part. It's not going to work. I want all the parts, okay? If you want me to grade this, I want all the parts. And then, again, the last week of class, August 3rd to 6th, we will present. And then, of course, since we don't have a final exam, you will be done with social justice, okay? Sound okay so far? Boom.
This was going to be the last one.
This is the last thing. This is the last thing. So, we're just about out of time. So again, tomorrow I'll talk to you a little bit about sources, how to find them, and how to find good, credible ones, okay? I'll give you some time to narrow down a topic, and we can kind of help each other figure that out tomorrow, okay? Quick questions before we break. How many people, Reza says, how many people can work together in a group? Just 2, okay? So you can be in a group of 2, or you can work on your own, your choice, okay? Yes. Yes, and yeah, I'll talk a little bit about sources tomorrow, okay? Okay, maybe I'll leave it there. You can pack it up, come back tomorrow, and we'll start figuring out how to move forward on this, okay? So, yeah, that's it. Have a good afternoon. I'll see you tomorrow.